Salvate. This is Dr. Thomas, of course, and welcome to this week's video tutorial. Again, as a rule, given this format, I will be sending out weekly videos such as the current one in which we cover a chapter. It's probably a good idea to watch the video a couple of times, especially if you don't understand concepts. As many of you know, learning a language is a skill. So like sports, practice is the key to acquiring fluency. At the same time, Latin is a little different than a modern language. I also teach German, so I have a little bit of insight into this. A modern language, for example, will have a certain spontaneity where one is not thinking about the grammar. One is simply speaking as I am now and as you do every day. Latin, by contrast, because it's not a living language, will, in one sense, always lack the spontaneity of a modern language. That's why I often say that Latin, unlike a modern language, is not learned but studied. So you can learn German, you can learn French, you can learn Chinese. You don't really learn Latin, you study Latin. And of course, that is its great virtue from modern languages. Also, in terms of the course itself, Wednesdays, as I mentioned, I will be setting up a Blackboard discussion thread, just using the text, not video, so you can pretty much join at any time. But Wednesday will be the time that I go on there to answer any questions. If you don't have questions, please at least sign on, or just say I understand everything, or everything's good, or no questions, just so I can take attendance and use that as your participation grade. As we get closer to taking a test, I'll send out a sample test so you can have an idea about what it might look like. But again, I've been doing this for many years. I know you haven't had me in Latin, but I'm sure you'll find the course fair and the testing representative of what we've been doing. All right, so let's go into, one final note. Wednesdays, I should be home by 6. If not, it'll be 6:10, 6:15 latest. Again, I hope to be home by 6, but if I am a few minutes late logging on for the Blackboard thread, just be patient, drink a cup of coffee, enjoy the leisure as the Romans did, the otium. But rest assured I will be online by 6:15 latest, but certainly in most cases before then. Okay, so we're going to start with Caput Viginti, chapter 20. Again, it's my understanding you either did this chapter or this is where you left off, but either way, we're going to pick it up here. So if you already know this, great. It's a chance to review. Just like sports, LeBron James shoots free throws every day. Golfers, they practice their putting every day, and because learning a language is a skill, if it is review, it's probably not a bad thing. So you can see the grammar in this chapter is fourth declension, ablatives of place, and just a general note with the declensions. All this is readily, of course, available online. Here's what I have found one to be more aesthetically. But ultimately, these need to be memorized or at least familiarized. And so you have to learn the I, autumn, is, o, e, autumn, os, blank, a, ibos, ebos. Here we're getting the ui, ebos, ebos, ace, adam, abos, abos. Probably needs to be memorized. As you know, the vast majority of Latin words will use, or nouns will use the first 3 declensions, but of course we have 5 declensions. As you know, what came first, people speaking or grammar? Clearly people speaking. So in one sense, these declension endings are somewhat after the fact, but it's just how Latin works because it's an inflected language, and so being able to identify and know to what declension a noun, an adjective belongs to is really the key for learning Latin. As I will stress throughout the term, the verbs are a little bit trickier just because in Latin, unlike English, if you make a mistake in the spelling, it's not just a spelling mistake, which in English grammar is not the most egregious kind of mistake, but it affects the meaning. But certainly this is much more manageable, especially the first three. If you can memorize the first three in particular and have some idea how to apply them and understand them, then you'll do quite well in Latin. Anyway, I just got this online. If you just Google Latin noun declensions and look under images, you'll see something like this or something that's more appealing to you. But I recommend having this next to you at all times when you're doing your Latin work, just because this needs to be referenced continuously until you have it in your head. So let me go back to the chapter here, and you're gonna want to read this on your own a couple times. One of the things it points out is the macrons. I actually learned Latin in England, and they didn't use macrons there. The macrons are important because they do affect the meaning and pronunciation, but originally Latin did not have macrons, but it does point out unique spellings, and especially if you do poetry, which I don't. I'm a philosopher. I don't do a whole lot of poetry other than Goethe in the German tradition. But at any rate, it is important to recognize the macrons just because it's going to indicate what case a noun belongs to. So definitely take a look at this, and you can see here's our us, ui, u, us, ibus, is, ibus. I'm going to move on to the ablative. The ablative, as you probably know, is probably the trickiest of the cases, just because it constitutes prepositional phrases, and because there's so many different prepositions and a lot of times Latin will not use the preposition, as you can see from over here. There's no from. Until you get that preposition in your head, it may seem a little bit counterintuitive as to how to translate it. But many languages do not have prepositions. My wife, who's from Finland, Finns are actually very good at Latin because Finnish actually has 16 cases, and Finns tend not to use prepositions either, hence endings. But of course, that doesn't help us necessarily because for most of us, I believe English is our first language. But you want to take a look at these examples. And of course, the reason they're called ablatives of place and separation is because the noun that follows, the so-called object of the preposition or the object of the case, is going to be in the ablative. So you can see this is first declension, ablative singular. This is third declension, ablative plural, de montibus. This is second declension, ablative plural, eorum is os is. And of course, this is third declension, ablative singular. And again, if you go back to this chart, and I really recommend having this out all the time, you can sort of see, if you review what I just said, in case you don't know it, that indeed matches the ablative case that I just noted. But like anything else, this one's a little bit tricky. As you know, and I'll explain this in greater detail when we get to the tests, but you will be able to use a dictionary for your tests, except for the vocabulary part. At that point, once you complete the vocabulary, then you'll be able to use a dictionary. But as many of you know, using a Latin dictionary is not, you still have to know the Latin because, for example, you're not going to find the word montibus in the dictionary. You're going to find the nominative or subject form mons. So even using a dictionary, it requires still knowing some Latin. I had a student several years ago at Campbell. He tended not to come to class. Fair enough. I'm very German in the way I teach. In Germany, you don't get points for just existing. You actually have to do something. Go figure that. So he missed a number of days, and fair enough. But then he showed up on the final exam. And of course, since he wasn't there, you can imagine the final exam was somewhat novel to him. But he also didn't have a dictionary, even though it says in the syllabus, dictionary required. So he says, Dr. Thomas, can I go to the bookstore to see if they have a dictionary? I said, sure. So he goes to the bookstore, and of course they don't have any, or they've been sent back because of overstock. So he comes back, and I can see the wheels are turning. I saw a little mouse inside his head actually running very quickly. And he says, "Can I go to the library?" I said, "Sure." And so he goes to the library, comes back, and the library does have dictionaries, but the one they had was literally several volumes of the unabridged Oxford Dictionary in folios. So he comes back with a big stack of hardbound books. And of course, not only was it somewhat comical, but needless to say, it didn't go well for him on the test because he just had too much information and he never really learned how to use a dictionary. So learning how to use a dictionary is important. Maybe we'll talk about that in a different lesson, although you should know that by now since this is more elementary. And that's something I imagine Miss Bird did in an earlier lesson. If not, let me know and we can talk about that for a future lesson. At any rate, so definitely study these examples. Probably read. In my experience, you probably want to read the introduction of every chapter twice. Maybe read the examples 3 times after that, because a lot of it is memorization at that point. It's probably not going to be too helpful to keep going back, but probably twice, just because the Wheelock is very grammar oriented, and the conceptual apparatia of the book, namely all this grammatical language governed by one of the prepositions. You know that, but if you're not a language teacher or you love grammar or you're an English major, this kind of language may seem a little bit academic. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into the lesson proper. I believe Wheelock still has an active website where you can go over the vocabulary and listen to an audio for pronunciation. As you know, Latin is very intuitive. It's a very phonetic language. You pretty much speak it like it looks. And then if you have a macron, just make it a long vowel. So, for example, just manus, manus, metus, metus, mons, montis. And since we're not really focusing on conversational Latin or speaking, it's not that big a deal. But speaking aloud is important. I stress this all the time, especially with Latin, because the danger is to turn it into a kind of quiet, contemplative activity. Needless to say, adopting and living a contemplative life, which as a philosopher I fully support, is probably not how most Americans live. We're very active, practical, and so you're really doing yourself a disservice and probably not learning as quickly as you could, and hence having time to spend on other things that of necessity and interest if you're not reading these words aloud. I cannot stress enough, for most people do not read these words silently. Speak them aloud. Think about how we all learned our native language. We didn't sit there and just sit there silently. We heard our parents speak, and we repeated the words that they said. We read aloud. So unlike a modern language, one of the not pitfalls, but one of the caveats with Latin is to turn it into kind of a dead silence. But for most people, that goes against how they live their lives, and so they're going against nature. And not to get too romanticized with you, but when we go against nature, I can tell you things tend not to go well. So we'll leave it at that. All right, so definitely go over this. Use the website. Let's go into the exercises here. As a rule, we will focus on the sententia antiqui, the proverbs, and the longer passage. And for the test, it will consist of vocabulary. Again, we don't need to worry about this now, but will be simple matching. Again, I'll send out a sample test, so please don't send me now an email because we're not even there yet. So let's focus on the content, then we can worry about the test later. But it'll be simple matching. For example, fructus, and you'll match the English word fruit. And so everybody should do very well. But again, you won't be able to use a dictionary for this part of the test. So you have to memorize those words. And then for this part, the next 2 parts, you will be able to use a dictionary. And it'll be the same sentences right out of the book, as you will see. So it's very doable. But one of the nice things I like about Latin is there's not a lot of language per se, but the language is meaningful. Because as you know, the only Latin we really have is based on its great authors. We don't really have pop culture. We don't have everyday. So my German classes, I enjoy, and I know students enjoy, bringing in music and pop culture and food and Oktoberfest und so weiter. Aber es geht nicht mit Latein. Also müssen wir alles lesen. We have to read everything and übersetzen, translate, and so forth. At any rate, let's go into the content here. So here we have Cornua servum e periculis defendunt. And again, you're going to obviously need to know the vocab, so I'm not going to keep going back and forth. You'll have to do that on your own just because it gets a little bit unwieldy. But right away, we should look at the vocabulary, and we know the verbs in the third person plural, and they give us a little bit of vocab here too. And so we know based on that and the context that this is the subject and this is the verb. As you know, Latin often doesn't give us a separate subject, but here we do. And then here we have the direct object because it's second declension accusative singular, us, io, o, and then here, or excuse me, us, io, o. And then here we have an example of the ablative of separation from dangers. So the translation, by the way, translation, I will tend to give a literal translation during the course of the semester. And what I mean by that is, literal works, I think, especially given this format. But oftentimes, obviously, you want to give it a more living translation where it doesn't sound so stilted. That's the nature of translation. It's not a one-to-one. It's based on style, and language always changes. We don't write like Thomas Jefferson wrote for a lot of reasons, but yet he still is using English. And so I will tend to give a literal translation. The most important thing is you have the vocabulary, and you have the words, and you have the right tenses. And so, for example, if you put on the test "will defend," that would be, you would lose points because it's not in the future tense. So even though we're giving a literal translation, you still, you can't just make stuff up and change the vocabulary and change the tenses and things like that. So here we have the horns defend the stag from dangers. So here's our subject, cornua. So this is a neuter noun. So this is going to be a second declension neuter, I believe. So the horns defend the stag. The stag is the deer. And then from dangers. Here, periculum also is a neuter noun. So if you look, and this is where you really have to have this next to you, because I'm not always going to refer to it. But you can see the periculis. So here's our neuter, because danger's neuter. So there's the is that we're referring to. So from the dangers is how we're explaining the is. And of course, the caravum, or the stag, that's the direct object. So we need second declension accusative singular, namely So we go back to the entire example is horns, or the horns defend the stag or the deer from dangers. Again, that sounds, now Marshall, as you know, his Latin is a little bit tricky because he does a lot of satire. My sense is, based on my other readings of him, is you can see that a satirist often sort of comments on human behaviors where human beings think they're moral or rational, but not really, that they're not really doing anything that animals wouldn't do. And so if you think about how humor works, think of people that you find funny or humorous or comedians, is they sort of exploit the follies of human nature. In other words, that we all kind of think that we're better than we really are. It's just part of being human, or our selfishness, our self-interest. Whereas Marshall, being a satirist, really exploits that human beings, well, we're not so clever after all. And so one of the challenges with Wheelock, of course, is we don't have the larger context, but I'm going to take a guess and say that's what it means. Yeah. Here we have number 2, Cicero. As you know, we know more about ancient Rome from Cicero than any other writer. And so that's why he figures so prominently in the Wheelock's Latin. As you know, he's Rome's greatest statesman, 106 to 43 BC. The founding fathers spent a lot of time reading Cicero. When we talk about the Roman Republic, we tend to think of Cicero. I think one famous historian said it best that Martial and Horace and Virgil and Quintilian and Caesar, they all wrote in Latin. Cicero wrote as a Roman. And so nobody was more Roman, more dedicated to the Roman cause, i.e. the Republic, than Cicero. And so he's very interesting for a lot of reasons, including his Latin. His Latin is sort of, in my opinion, the gold standard, at least for Latin prose. Verse, a little bit different, probably Virgil or Ovid. At any rate, here you can see Cicero, although he was very Roman and very proud to be Roman, he recognized that the Greeks were their intellectual masters, that the Greeks, of course, invented the idea of literature, going back to Homer. They invented philosophy. They invented the idea of democracy, even though they didn't practice it. So many of you are in the sciences. Most of our scientific, not just words, but the very notion or ideas of biology and of physics, these are all Greek ideas. Clearly, our methods and our knowledge has progressed since then, but the Greeks are the originators of the Western mind insofar as we believe that the mind is capable of rational scientific pursuits. Cicero recognized that as well. So here we have Oedipus deprived himself from his two eyes. So Oedipus is our subject, and then deprived, that means that he took out, he cut out. And then himself, anytime you see say in Latin, it always refers back to the subject. So himself, herself, itself. Here it's referring back to Oedipus. So deprived himself from two eyes. Again, that probably in everyday English would say Oedipus took out his two eyes after he figured out that he had killed his father and married his mother. From his two eyes, here oculus duobus is because oculus is second declension. So again, we have this ablative of separation again. So oculis duobus, the spelling is a little bit different on that one, but we still have the ending here in the ablative. So there's another example of the ablative of separation there. Also, of course, here is our verb in the perfect. Isti eat, imus istis erunt. So this is third conjugation, third person singular, agreeing with the subject, Oedipus. Moving on here. So one of the nice things about Latin is, you tend to kind of repeat the same explanations over and over again. So there are times when I won't parse or talk about every element, but over time you kind of keep doing the same thing over and over again. So hopefully it'll make you get better and better at it. So here we have Themistocles bello persico Graecium servitute liberavit. And again, we always want to use our vocab down here. So Themistocles, of course, was a famous Greek. He's talking about the war between the Greeks and the Persians. So Themistocles liberated or freed. Once again, we have past tense here. How do we know that? Because we have the perfect ending here. So we need to understand, going back, I forget what chapter perfect was in Latin, but this is not present tense or future tense, but the perfect. Often, and especially in the Wheelocks, we'll translate the perfect simply with our simple past. So literally liberated or freed. So Themistocles liberated the Greeks. Now this is interesting because it's actually in the singular. So again, if you look back at your declension chart, that first declension accusative singular is am, but it's referring to, I guess in this case we can go with Greece. So yeah, so Themistocles liberated Greece. So that's the direct object. That's why we're putting it in the accusative, because as you know from previous courses, the accusative is our direct object. So we go back to example here. Themistocles liberated Greece, and then here, from servitude or from bondage. There is our ablative of separation. So that is third declension ablative singular. So if you look on your chart again, this is always the harder part with Latin, or the ablative and the third declension. But here, that's why it ends in E, because it's the ablative of separation. So he liberated Greece from servitude. And then in the Persian War. As you know, Latin often puts the adjective after the noun, whereas English does it the opposite. But also here we have ablative of place, because notice that bellum, of course, is second declension neuter. So if we go second declension neuter, if you look on your declension chart, that this is O. So that's where we're getting bello. In fact, here they haven't used the word war as the paradigm or the example. Moving on here, of course, the great Greek orator would have appealed to Cicero, who himself was an orator. Demosthenes multos versus unos spiritu pronuntibat. So here we have Demosthenes, and then literally pronounced, but again, that sounds a little bit weird, but literally, and then it's actually in the imperfect. So was pronouncing, or did pronounce, or used to pronounce. You're going to see, once again, this is a good example of what I was saying earlier, that the translation is going to sound a little bit stilted. I recommend, especially for what we're doing, especially since we're online and we don't have the flexibility of massaging this over in a classroom, just to keep it literal. So I would just say Demosthenes pronounced, and then pronounced what? Many verses in one breath. Now, what's the idea behind that? Well, that everything he said was important. So he did not waste words. He wasn't silly. For him, one sentence was worth more than 100 pages of somebody who's just babbling and talking nonsense. Hence, most politicians could probably, profit by reading or rereading Demosthenes. Anyway, so Demosthenes pronounced, or was pronouncing, many verses, in other words, many important words, in one breath. Now, this is interesting, because here we have, I remember when I first took up Latin, I found this a little bit unclear, but it's just the way Latin works, as you know, that here, this is OS is second declension accusative plural. So again, I'm not going to always go back to this. So really, hopefully you have this, you'll print this out and put it side by side. But here is second declension accusative plural. There's the OS. So that's where we're getting the multos. But we have versus, because verse is fourth declension, which is the grammar topic in this chapter. So there we have multos versus. And so that's where we're getting that accusative direct object. And so we just have to recognize that we have two different cases. And then similarly, in one breath, you can see here, this is also going to be second declension ablative singular, so us, e, o, o. But then we have the fourth declension ablative singular, which is the u. So this one's a little bit tricky. You can see almost, for most of you, you're probably just going to have to memorize it. Because, again, unless you really love grammar, or your Latin is really good, or it takes a while to get comfortable going back and forth between different cases. So here we have the spiritu, but then we have uno, but then we still have to say in one breath. And so we have to add that preposition in, and that's just the way Latin works. And so we go back here just to kind of recapitulate. Demosthenes used to say many verses in one breath. It's always a challenge with the Wheelocks, is it sounds a little bit very philosophical, very abstract. I think the original idea in the textbook, and this is what we don't have the advantage of, can't really talk about this too much in class. These are things that would need to be discussed in terms of what does that actually mean, or how do we translate that into better, more fluid English. But given the online format, or virtual format. We just don't have that flexibility. All right, number 5. This is Horace. Horace is interesting because wouldn't be quite true to say that he came from a poor family, but he came from humble beginnings, and hence a lot of his language is concerned with everyday life and how living a simple life. And here he's saying, "Persicos apparetus odi," and this is where we get the word odious. Odious means you don't like something. So I hate literally Persian display. In other words, he doesn't like their arrogance. So we'll kind of leave it at that. But notice the os and the us, those are both in the accusative. So once again, we go back to right here, Persicus. There's the the Persian, but then the display is the us. Now, why is it in the plural? Well, because he doesn't, because there's more than one Persian. So that's where the grammar, you just got to think about how it actually works. There's not one person doing it. So for Latin, you wouldn't put it in the singular because there's many Persians that make up stereotypes, or however you want to look at it. So that's why we have the plural form. Oh, here it is right here of the words here. Moving on to number 6. Iste, often a kind of a term of rebuke or reproach in Latin, reproach. So literally he or that person. This one's a little bit tricky too. Again, the ablative is tricky. So because it requires kind of, one of the challenges of learning a language, I think, is in one sense, how do you obtain fluency? Well, you do when you have it. Until then, it can seem very mechanical, very kind of trotting along, and so. But trust me, the more you practice it, as you know, I'm fluent in German. My Latin isn't bad either, and so I know many languages. And if I can learn these things, you can learn these things too. But you have to kind of just methodically work your way through, like in any discipline or life, and eventually you get better and better at it. Iste communi sensu caret, literally that person is devoid of common sense. I'm going to skip this one, but here I will mention that in terms of this one, actually has some other elements that are somewhat complex. But when you look at in your dictionary, for example, if you look up careo, C-A-R-E-O, you should have, if you have a decent dictionary, it should say plus the ablative. So when you use this word, which means to be devoid of or to be without, the objects or the words that go with it need to be in the ablative. And so that's why we have sensu, and then here's actually third declension as well. This actually has a unique ending or spelling, so that's why I'm going to leave that right there. But it is common sense in terms of, which I think people can benefit from remembering. Common sense means good for the community. So like so much else of our language, we tend to, I'm actually working on a book, American Individualism, and individualism, which of course is tied to individual rights and liberties and freedom, has lost its public sense, certainly as the founders understood it. But I think as we all would think that the individual not only is important, but achieves greater meaning when he or she is contributing to some public good. And Horace, I think, is touching upon that. So that man is without common sense. Number 7, senectus nos privat omnibus voluptatibus, neque longe abes e morte. As you know, near the end of his life, Cicero wrote many, many books, especially on philosophy. He was sort of forced into political exile for reasons which we can talk about during this course. And so one of the nice, interesting things about Cicero is that his beloved daughter Tullia had died around this time, giving birth to a child. And of course, he was, the Republic at that point was in a civil war and soon would be, well, was already, had sort of collapsed, with with Julius Caesar and his assassination. And of course, it wouldn't be till 31 BC with with Caesar Augustus, where the so-called imperium or empire would rebuild Rome from the ground up, so to speak. But my point being is that even though he's living a life of personal tragedy, his language really doesn't express pessimism. Modern language, or excuse me, modern literature, by contrast, some of you might have studied modern literature, especially in the 20th century and beyond. It's just so pessimistic and cynical. I can't go into it in greater detail now, but the 20th century has destroyed man's belief in himself. That's why so much of our language and literature, and look at T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, you could go on and on, and our institutions are just struggling to try to reclaim some sense of purposive human meaning. We'll have to leave it at that, but we could benefit by reading authors like Cicero or Christian authors who were living in dark times, as we all are in one sense, and yet they don't give up on life, and they don't view life as some private concern where we're living basically a kind of crepuscular existence. So here we have, going back to Latin, senectus nos privat omnibus voluptatibus neque longe avis a morte. So he wrote a influential essay called De Senectute, on old age. So even though you get older, it doesn't mean that your life's over. It's just that, maybe physically, but of course for Cicero, as for most of us, I would think, even though many of you are young, what it means to be human is not physical. I mean, there are many animals that are much stronger than human beings, but it's what we do internally. It's what we do with our minds, with our souls, with our hearts. That's how knowledge and morality is one. And yet we all do it. Our modern age puts a lot of emphasis on physical, empirical well-being. And at the end of the day, I think we all agree it's our spirit. And so even though we're older and our bodies may be less vital, our minds, in one sense, should be more vital if we're actually learning from experience. So old age deprives us from all pleasures, nor is it a long way from death. So, physically, I mean, you guys are college students. You know what I'm talking about is that this is probably the peak for most of you of your sensual voluptuousness. You look at my nephew, who's a senior at the University of South Carolina. Every year we go down to visit him, and we go to a football game, and we go to frat sorority row, and it's like Sodom and Gomorrah in there. Just a cesspool of voluptuousness, and they're having a good time. But it's just he and other college students are probably at the peak of that kind of voluptuousness. I assume when he graduates, his father has already told him he's going to cut him off economically. He's actually have to get a job and perhaps get married and raise a family. And certainly his wife or his children would suffer if he's just still living on frat row. So even though as we get older, we lose some of our sensual pleasures just because we have other responsibilities, go figure, and we're getting closer and closer to death, we still have a lot to live for. But this is part of that larger context that Cicero is referring to. Again, we're not reading the entire essay, obviously, but old age deprives us from all voluptuousness. So there's the ablative of separation. So third declension ablative plural is ibus, is ibus, is ibus. Nor is it a long ways from death. So here's also ablative of separation. Third declension ablative singular is e. And they give us some vocab down here. Number 8. Nullus accusator caret culpa omnes peccavimus. Now, Seneca is one of my intellectual heroes. Like Socrates, the powers that be didn't find him to be heroic. They found him as a threat to their mediocrity, and so Nero's, beheaded him. That's a bad joke, but maybe it's a good thing that I'm doing this online because I am a philosopher, and I don't want you guys doing the same to your old teacher. At any rate, like Socrates, Nero didn't like what Seneca was saying, namely the truth. And he's often associated with Stoicism. And his Latin actually is fairly intuitive compared to like Martial and Juvenal, for example, very difficult Latin, I think. But here he's saying no accuser is devoid or free from guilt. All sin, all people sin. How true is that? And of course, if somebody does wrong to you, you should accuse them. But of course, Seneca, being a philosopher, is saying that ultimately that still leaves big questions about whether or not human beings as a species are capable of doing justice. And of course, it's very complex, is that even our legal institutions are awash in money and corruption. And so Seneca, like any true philosopher, is kind of looking at das Ganze, or the complete picture of things, and saying, yeah, that accuser was perhaps right to accuse that person, for an act of justice. But at the end of the day, we need to understand the reasons why somebody commits a crime. And of course, there we get into the nature nurture. Is it just society? Is it just human beings? What are we as human beings doing as human beings and as a body politic to help develop us morally, so that we don't simply view crimes and immoral acts as right as they rightly should be, as crimes, but rather as failures of human nature. So again, very complex, but I think that's what he's saying here, is that no accuser is devoid of guilt. All men sin. So here's our ablative of separation, culpability, first declension, ablative singular is A. So again, just to kind of give you a reference here, there's our culpe. All right, moving on here. Again, a lot of Cicero in this book for reasons I mentioned earlier. Literally no part of life is able to be free from duty. Cicero's, and I think we're the founding fathers, and many people, we all know it, is that we are individuals, but we have a duty or an office and a purpose to not just think of ourselves, but other people and humanity writ large. And so if we act like our lives are free from public responsibilities, well, we shouldn't be surprised if some of the pessimisms that I alluded to earlier, where we look at public life and we wonder why things are so bad. Well, Cicero, being a good rationalist, saying, well, we're doing it to ourselves. In fact, that's pretty much what Seneca was saying too. What Jesus kind of says the same thing, but obviously in a different way, is that if we were truly living a godly life, as the Puritans tried to, that was really the Puritan dilemma, right? According to the great historian Edward S. Morgan, how to live a godly life in an ungodly world. If we're going to build that city on a hill, to follow the Puritan narrative, if we're putting man before God, or if we're putting self-interest ahead of public duty, which you'll see in a second is what Cicero is talking about in terms of the Catiline conspiracy. If we're doing that, then it's irrational. I was at the store the other day, and of course this person, not of course, but this person had his or her phone on, and as if other people are interested in their conversations, and I wasn't following this person, but I was in the same aisle, and these two individuals, all they're doing is complaining about this person and that person. It was about their work, but that person, and it's just, that's fine. You may be right to accuse that person, but just complaining about it is not going to help. And so, if we don't use, according to Cicero, if we don't use our rational morality, which has to be developed, we're not born with it, we have to develop it, which goes all the way back to Aristotle, if not just more intuitively, of course. if we don't develop our sense of public office and responsibility, we're not only stripping or vacating public life of any moral purpose, we're actually doing the same to ourselves, because we ourselves are community-bound creatures. The environment does affect us, whether or not people want to admit it or not. So if we have a poor public life, that cannot but help corrupt the individual, unless, of course, we take the route of asceticism, which maybe is really not a living option in 2022, namely of joining a monastery or convent. So I assume most of you are interested in living in society. And I think it's probably maybe one reason you went to Campbell is that Campbell has its own pressures as an institution, as all universities do, but at least Campbell's still holding on to some serious sense of moral purpose and giving back to community, whereas, let's be honest, power and money and pleasure they rule the roost right now. But again, let's see. So there is our ablative of separation, no part of life. There's first declension, genitive singular, is able to be free. So there's our infinitive. As you know, with the Wheelocks, if you see words in italics, that's the translation. If you see words with quotation marks, those are derivatives or words that come from that Latin word. So we get the word vacate and evacuate, not vacation. We get the word vacate and evacuate from vacare. Vacation, a little footnote, that would be more associated with otium or leisure. So it would be a false cognate. So no part of life is able to be free from duty. Once again, why the ablative is a little bit tricky, we have to come up with that preposition in order to get the second declension ablative singular O. Same thing here. Again, we mentioned earlier, when you look up cario in your dictionary, it should say ablative. So sure enough, we have the ablative second declension again. And it says Quintilian, who's an important educator, important for early Christianity too. The first virtue is to be free from vice. Don't confuse this with life. Some people, because vita is life, but this is V-I-T-I, not V-I-T-A. So here's a good one, right? This is awesome. I love Quintilian because I think Christian ecclesiastical Latin is a little bit more intuitive, just because we know the Bible, and hence the translation is sometimes a little bit easier versus the classical Latin. But the first virtue is to be free from vice. So there it is. Second declension, ablative singular, us, e, o, o. So if you look on the declension chart, you'll see the letter O. I think we'll stop here. As a rule, we'll probably do about 10 of this. We could continue on, but I want to go to the larger passage. So on the test, you will only be tested on the ones we cover. So when you have the test in a couple of weeks, which will cover the first 3 chapters, so 20, 21, 22, you'll see some of these, not all of them, but you'll see some of these, a couple from chapter 20, a couple from chapter 21, and a couple from chapter 22. As a rule, as you'll see, you'll have about maybe 7 or 8 sententia. You'll have vocabulary, 7 or 8 sententia antiquae, a couple from each chapter, and you'll have one of the 3 longer readings. So it could be this one, it could be chapter 21, chapter 22. You need to prepare all 3, obviously. But with the dictionary, and if you study and you pay attention to what we're talking about, although again, if I'm being completely honest, and this is where Latin is different than German and modern subjects, a lot of this is probably going to have to be memorized. But as you know, all throughout the ages, people didn't have computers and have books. I actually teach younger kids Latin and philosophy, and one of the things where I scratch my head is they have so many pencils and pens and water bottles, and of course their parents send them all this stuff, and it happens at every school, and they don't, all they are is distractions. All these pencils and pens and notebooks and all the other stuff. I try to shock them into recognizing that they're hurting themselves is you need one pen or pencil in a notebook. You don't need any water. You don't need any food. And of course, these are younger kids. They're looking at me like I'm crazy, but all they do is they're fidgety, and it's just a distraction all throughout history. And those of you doing more advanced studies in some of your majors, it's mental. Education is what happens within us. And so really all throughout history, memory was how people learned. Take the family Bible. You memorize the Bible. Decline of memory, in one sense, is it's a question. Let's put it that way, or a series of questions. So memorizing or internalizing, as you know, most language, memory means internalizing. What goes on within you, that's really if you know something. If you can do it from memory, then you really know it. If you're a brain surgeon and you walk in the surgery room, as you know, and I tell this to my little students all the time, my younger students, if you have to look on YouTube how to perform a surgery, God help us. So we have the surgery memorized. We don't need to look at a script. Great athletes, that muscle memory. I mean, so yeah, it helps to have some notes, but ultimately Latin will remind you just how real knowledge works. Real skill it has to be internalized. Or in our case, if you look up a word in a dictionary, oh, that's it. And so, but it has to be spontaneous. Otherwise, we probably don't know it. And then it's mechanical, and then that's why we're bored. That's why we don't like it. That's why we're in a hurry. Little footnote is I always tell my younger students, if you don't like Latin, and of course a lot of them, they're bored, that means you don't like freedom, because Latin, there's nothing necessary about learning Latin in 2022. It is the most free or unnecessary subject that, as I tell them, that they will likely ever learn. And the fact that they don't like freedom, that they only like necessity, is why they will never live free lives. And of course, that rattles them. And so, but I'm trying to wake them up a little bit because they're basically half asleep. All right. So let's read this here. This is an excerpt from Cicero's famous speech against Catiline. I guess there were some earlier passages, as you may recall, earlier in Wheelock's Latin. So you want to look at this gloss here. I did bring so here, very famous. I think this was earlier in the book as well, but obviously this is an artistic rendition. But there's Cicero, there's other senators, there's Catilina, who has been ostracized, so to speak, left in the dark because of his attempted coup d'etat, or an attempt to overrule the election results. Now the real context is much more complex, but you can look into it on your own. But he basically was circumventing tradition and order and law for his own self-interest, and it didn't work out for him, obviously. That's one thing about, I think, the ancient world that I find interesting, is that, because again, this, you could research this your entire life in terms of the accuracy of the sources, is that pretty much every source we have about Latin and Rome and Christian thought based in Latin is these are individuals who are giving their lives for their beliefs. And even recently in another class for my younger kids, we were reading about Mount Vesuvius, and it was about Plinius and his uncle. And his uncle, who was a naturalist, went to investigate the cloud of smoke, and he never came back. In other words, he died. Because it erupted, and that was the end of him. But all throughout, in pretty much every Latin text, even Julius Caesar, that Julius Caesar was not the dictator that Adolf Hitler was, that he gave his life for certain ideals that were part of Roman civilization. So to me, that's one of the more interesting aspects of why you would learn Latin, is you should be thinking about, what are we going to sacrifice our lives for to live meaningful lives in a public, moral, spiritual sense? So you can see right here that Cicero gave his life. Eventually, as you know, he was beheaded for fighting for some important notion of Republican, or rather Roman republicanism, especially virtue. And this piece sort of reminds us of that. And so to me, that's, one of the great things about Latin is that it should remind us a lot um, living a life of service and purpose. Anyway, so let's go back to this here. So habemus senatus consultum contra te, Catilina, vehemens et grave acre iudium habemus et viris et concilium civitas nostra habet. Quid est, Catilina? Cur Romanis, o Dio matales, discere nunc ex hac urbe cum male manus sceleratorum, magnum meto me liberabis, si omnis istos coniratos tecum educes. Nisi nunc disceris, te sito eicemus, nihil in civitate nostre de delectare potest, age, dende curret manlium istum amicum malum, te Dio destifit arrevit incipi nunc pare copias et gerum bellum in civitatem. Brevi temporete omnis tuos hostes patriae vincemus et omnis vos poenis grave semper dabitis. So we got a little bit of vocab over here. Mus, of course, osmos tisnet. So I assume that you guys covered this last 2 quarters or semesters rather. So we have the Senate. So I'm actually going to give you like a literal translation here. I'm going to go word by word, and then we'll go back and try to smooth it out a little bit and talk about the grammar. So we have the Senate we have the Senate decree against you, Catiline. Strong and serious. Sharp of judgment we have, and men and plan state are have. What is, Catiline? Why do you remain? O gods immortal! Leave now from this city with bad retinue of men. In great fear me you will free, if all those conspirators with you lead. Except now you lead, unless now you leave, you quickly we will throw out. Nothing in state are you to delight is able. Go, then run to Manlius, that friend bad. You for a while you have desired. Begin now. Prepare troops and wage war against the state. In short time you and all your enemies of the fatherland we will defeat, and all you punishment serious always you will be given. So that was kind of like a literal translation, but for some of you, in fact, maybe all of you, quite frankly, this is how I learned Latin, is that you're going to have to get your dictionary out and look up these words. Now there is Whitaker's words, which you may be familiar with, which I gave an example here, which I also recommend, kind of an online dictionary by the University of Notre Dame. So you just type in the word like civitas, but of course you still have to kind of know the context. Clearly naturalization would not be, and he's not talking about citizen rights. So the state is how, the state of Rome is how Cicero's using it. So going back to the text here, getting out the dictionary, and that's why I think, already we're approaching an hour of screen time, and watching this, giving it and maybe watching it twice, and then having our discussion board for clarification on Wednesday, So this is still going to require, like, if you actually want to learn Latin this semester, you probably have to put in 5 hours a week, or 4 to 5. I mean, just because remember, I'm fluent in German as well, so I know what it takes and how many millions of American students study a language at a university, but they don't really know the language. As you know, I love Spanish. I love Dr. Jones. I have a lot of friends, Dr. Ortiz, but a lot of friends who speak Spanish, but they would tell you ordering a burrito at a restaurant is not knowing Spanish. And so we got to do a little bit better than that. So it probably takes 4 to 5 weeks, like a sport, like going to the gym, that if you really want to learn Latin, you're not going to do it one hour a week. And then if you have a really good memory, you didn't really learn Latin, just kind of memorized it. So it's one of those things you have to decide what's going to work best for you. But my sense is probably about 4 to 5 hours a week. If you really want to learn Latin, because you're college students and you know how to learn, 2 to 3 hours a week is probably all you'll need to get a good grade. Less than that, you better have a good memory and you better know how to learn. Otherwise, on the test, it's not going to go as well as you would like. So, but I can't imagine more than 5 hours a week. Probably for most of you, 3 hours a week, especially if you're paying attention to what you're reading. Anyways, little pro tip, just because I've been there, I've done that, and that's sort of my sense of actually learning something. So let's go back to the text here. So we have what? Well, we have literally the Senate's consultation. Here I guess it's decree. So see how it says we have italics right here. So we're going to go with decree, but it is where we get the word consult and consultant. But again, the word in italics, that's the translation. So we have the decree of the Senate against you, Catalina. Now, what does that mean? Is that we have the judgment. In other words, that we've talked as a group, and you're on your own, right? You're the one that's on the outside. So we have the decree of the Senate against you, Catalina. Literally strong and serious. This is where we had to come up maybe with a better but if something is vehement in English, it's strong. If it's grave, it's serious. So the sense of course, is that after long and serious discussions, Catalina, we have rendered a judgment against you. But again, that free translation is difficult to derive from the Latin per se. That's why I gave you the literal translation a little bit earlier. So we have the decree of the Senate against you, Catalina, strong and grave. So on the test, if you wrote strong and grave, you're going to get credit. So, and then we have a sharpness of judgment, literally. So this actually is third declension genitive plural, is ibus, is ibus. So we have by a sharpness of judgment. So here's our ablative of separation. So the ablative, this one, even though it's just fourth declension ablative, there's a lot of ablative in this chapter compared to other chapters. And so by the sharpness of judgment, like an ace, think of Snoopy the Red Baron. This is where we get the ace. Acumen, sharpness. But it is third declension ablative singular. So if you look at the ending E. So we have by the sharpness of judgment. And what? And our men and the judgment, or rather the decree of the state, our state has. So this first sentence actually is a little bit tricky. It gets a little bit easier as we'll see down here. But so we put it all together is that we have the decree of the Senate against you, Catalina, strong and grave. We have by the sharpness of judgment, our state and men and, or excuse me, our state has a sharpness of judgment, Okay, I messed that one up again here. So let me try that again here. So we have a sharpness of judgment. Here's our subject. Our state, noster civitas, has both men and a decree against you. What is it, or literally, why is it, Catiline? Why do you remain? O immortal gods. In fact, this is like one of the most famous quotations that in all of Latin literature. O immortal gods, leave now from this city. So here's our imperative going back to chapter 1. So depart. So leave now from this city with your, literally with your band of bad conspirators. Or here they have with your band of wicked men. Kind of stopping right here at this semicolon, you can see rhetorically how, again, that first sentence is a little bit tricky to translate there, but you can see how in the first, that so far what Cicero is doing, and he does this a lot of, he's using both reason but also Roman tradition and moral judgment in a combination to indict Catiline of his crimes. So here he's invoking the power of the Senate. Here he's invoking the power of judgment. And here he's invoking the power of the gods. And so that's really Cicero's genius. And if you think about it, the founding fathers did a lot of the same thing. They used the meetings of the colonists. They used the laws of England and how King George III was exercising them unjustly against the original charters. But of course, we hold these truths to be self-evident. In God we trust. They also used natural law or the rightness and judgment of God to indicate that they were right and that the king was wrong. And so this rhetorically right here is sort of a case study of great law. Of course, in the modern era, many of you do, or pre-law, we don't really invoke natural law or God anymore, at least not in a legal sense. And that's one of the differences between classical law, which is natural based, which our founders also used, and probably contemporary law is the lack of invocation of, at least legally in any strict obvious sense of God. So we still perhaps take an oath based on the Bible, but it does seem more symbolic than believed. For Cicero, he actually did believe. He famously said that we Romans owe our superiority to our belief in the gods. Clearly, Christians believed in God. The Puritans believed in God. The founding fathers believed in God. They thought that without God, that civil society would lack a strong moral impetus. Our contemporary world, by contrast, again, look at the 21st century literature and thought. It's not clear that there's a strong sense of God in modern human behaviors. Okay, so we have the Senate's decree against you, Catiline, strong and serious. We have a harsh verdict. Our state has both strength and judgment. What is it, Catiline? Why are you still here? O immortal gods, leave now from this city. Notice that X is followed by the ablative, so this is a first declension. This is a demonstrative pronoun, right? So he, hike, hok, huyos, hui, hunk, hank, hok, hek, hok. So we need the ablative form, singular feminine, because city is feminine. So city is third declension, ablative singular. So leave now from the city with your wicked band of evil men. And then if you do, you will free me from great fear. In other words, that I don't have to worry about you and your wickedness bringing down the republic. Although at that point the writing was pretty much on the wall. But so bo be be boo is, as you know, the future tense, and it ends in s. So he's talking to Catiline, second person singular, future. you will free me from great danger. So here's our ablative of separation again. So here is second declension, ablative singular, us, o, o. Here's fourth declension, ablative. And you will free me from great anxiety if you lead all those conspirators with you. In other words, if you take all the people with whom you are plotting with you. So here is ablative, accusative, third declension accusative singular, or accusative plural. So that's going to be is ibus is ibus. Here is second declension accusative plural. E orem is os is, and then os is, and then with you. Unless you leave now, so nisi nunc disceris, we will throw you out quickly. So you can see after this first sentence, it gets a little bit easier. So unless you will leave now, we will throw you out quickly, we'll eject you. Nothing is able to delight you in our state. So nothing is able to delight you in our state. Why? Because our state, according to Cicero, is based on virtue and living a godly, inspired, virtuous life, which in Cicero's eyes, Catiline, in his corruption and his attempt to overthrow the Roman Republic based on tradition, laws, and God and the gods that Catiline doesn't seem to believe. Age, go, go. So here's our imperative. Then run to Manlius. Manlius, as you can see here, was one of Catiline's principal fellow conspirators. Then run. So here's our, going back to chapter 1, our imperative. Then run to Manlius, that bad man. And we said earlier, we saw the iste, that's a man who lacks common sense. Iste, that's often a pejorative term where somebody is morally corrupt. So then run to Manlius, that bad man. He has desired you for a long time. In other words, he has been waiting for you for a long time. In other words, that he's been waiting for you because you guys have been plotting together. Begin now. In other words, begin now to leave. And then he says, prepare troops and wage war. So prepare now and prepare your troops and prepare to wage war against the state. Now, he did have a large following, so the idea here is that leave. And you may think that you're going to raise an army, and you may think that you're going to take over Rome by force, but as you'll see in a short time, we will conquer. In a short time, we will conquer you and all of your conspirators, enemies of the fatherland. And all of you, so omnis dabitis, all of you will be given always, literally, the strictest penalties. In other words, that your crimes will go down in history as immoral. So, and all of you will be given. So vos means you. So all of you will be given always, literally, grave penalties. In other words, that you will go down in history for your crimes. So here, just a little footnote, we have first declension accusative plural. I arm is ace is. This is third declension accusative plural. Is ibus is ibus. So we didn't parse this as much as we did the other ones. So maybe for Wednesday, when we do our discussion, I can imagine that some of you might want clarification on some of these, just because we did go over it somewhat quickly, because we're already up to 1 hour and 15 minutes on this. Next time won't be nearly as long, obviously, because I did spend some time just kind of you getting comfortable with my teaching and talking about the tests and things like that. And I won't be doing that for future lessons. All right, so I will see you Wednesday. Or not see you, but talk with you per discussion board. Again, if you don't have discussion questions, at least sign on to indicate that you were there and that you understood everything, so you can get credit for participation. and that you're still enrolled in the course. And then if you can't look at it, or if you can't participate on Wednesday, then of course, do it when you can. But then of course, still let me know by saying that I saw everything or I understood everything, or if you do have questions, I can get back to it. Because of the format, that doesn't mean I'm going to be going on Thursday and and responding, just given my other professional schedule. But I will obviously respond to your comments as soon as I can. All right, so good luck on this, and we will talk soon.